kind of see you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we all set? Cool. I'm really excited to finally be here. I know you met Ivana, who's in the same lab as I am down at NASA Goddard, but been following along a little bit. I'm Jeremy. I am here as the token NASA guy for the week. So by the end of the week, I'm going to elevate all your senses to the top of the atmosphere, and none of the sat surface anymore. I also talk really, really fast when I get going, so please tell me to tap the brakes when I need to. You're not hurting my feelings. So, all right. So, okay, you've done your radiative transfer, done your hydrolyte, and what I want to just do for 25 minutes or so is talk about some of the simplest, in quotes, approaches for turning something that a satellite measures into a biogeophysical or an optical property that you can use here. And then I'm going to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the material kind of was inspired by Kurt, who I wish you all could meet because he's amazing. And Patrick's going to take over with what comes beyond the simple approaches we're going to talk about now. All right, so really, I don't know. I know you've had an introduction to remote sensing, I think, by now, but the reality is the satellite really just measures something at the top of the atmosphere. And if you wanted to be absolutely perfect, what you would end up doing is doing some kind of forward model like hydrogen in a couple ocean atmosphere system that would basically talk about how all the photons travel through the entire system, aerosols, whatever, got into the water, come back out. And by doing that perfect forward model over and over and over again, come up with best fit. Meaning, I just had a bunch of components here and a bunch of components here, a lot like what we just saw in your lab. What perfectly matches the satellite radiometry? This is how the atmospheric community works. But the reality is that it's stupidly computationally intensive, and a lot of this in the 70s, where it was just impossible to do any of that. So you have to find not shortcuts, but tools you have. Someone's talking.
Yeah, I was just.
Oh, yeah, perfect. All right, cool. Oh, it was? Okay. So back even years before I was born, they figured out clever ways to do this. And what you end up doing is you separate it. You solve for the atmosphere, and then you solve for the radiative transfer equation, which you've learned about. Again, you've talked a lot already this morning on forward model. You've measured something, inherent optical properties, biogeochemistry, whatever. You convert them into inherent optical properties, you plug them in the hydrolyte, and you come up with your answer. My role here this morning is to talk about so in this case, we're going to talk about what we're going to do in the morning is you throw it in some kind of magical black box, and you get like a chlorophyll value. Later this afternoon, we'll make more transparent. Okay, so we call these empirical algorithms. This is just really another way of saying statistical. Verifiable by observation or experience, has nothing to do with logic or theory. Just you make measurements and you can figure it out. And these are Kurt's words. Correlational models obtained from inspection of data sets. So things like you're going to go out into the field tomorrow, you're going to collect data. If you just simply inspect it and look for relationships based on statistics instead of theory, this is really what we're talking about. They really don't have to have any physical insight. This started in the 70s. This is science 1970, where really we got the first term ocean color. What they did is they on aircraft, and they were looking down the ocean, and they observed that as a function of wavelength, the percent of incident light varied before. You already see this, but dated back, this was before there was any satellites to do any of this, from aircraft, and this kind of spurred the idea that if we can do this from an aircraft, why can't we do this from a satellite system? And then some real pioneering work was done as they started thinking about what this might mean. Where went out and careful measure.
On est sûr que c'est demain.
Hey, there are some It's a relationship between concentration. Kind of the birth of the first ocean color algorithm, where you took the ratio of a blue to green reflectiveness in log space. So this is where, like, as you mature and you go to bars, and you're talking, like giving lectures at bars is absolutely the best thing in the world. With, hey, I can see microscopic marine algae from 400 meters above the sea surface. And then you say, hey, everything operates like your eye does. You know, I can see changes in color. With an instrument, I can measure better than your eye is better, but the measurement is actually a digital signal you can do something with. This is it. It's really just ratios to begin with. So we have the coastal zone color scanner, pioneer and proof of concept work. It only had 4 useful wavelengths of light, blue, green, and red. But from this, again, remembering that these are intelligent in space wavelengths designed to be in positions of optical significance. You can see that, yeah, you all know why 1.3 is here, but if you pick these 2 wavelengths, you can see this transition, inspection, inflection points. Yeah, you take that, and in early 80s, you get the first global image of this biosphere. The first observations of what an El Nino actually looks like. And this is all from taking radiances, throwing them into a statistical model. And I know this is familiar now, but it was only appearing in textbooks back when I was in school. And this is really, really remarkable because it was the first time biological oceanographers had actually seen distributions of blooms or how chlorophyll changes in, say, the Gulf Stream or things like that. I mean, this is like the moon landing. Nobody had ever been able to see the living ocean until and I'm intentionally trying to study them. I don't know organizers, but I'm sure there are people who are like, these are silly models, they're brain dead. But they serve a really, really remarkable purpose. And that was true in the 80s, and it's still true today. But we'll talk about why they break too. I mean, my whole goal here is you're all smarter than I am, but I know how things break better than you do because I've seen them break, and I want you to fix all of the broken parts. All right, so since then, there's effectively 3 different flavors of chlorophyll algorithms that have existed. We'll talk very quickly about them. Span ratios. Patrick will talk about neural networks, and then there are some clever ways of actually blending these 2 together. The reality is this is a deep oversimplification of everything. There are 1,000 different algorithms to get 1,000 different products. There are 900 PhDs in the past year turning one little knob and getting a new algorithm out of it. So I don't want to minimize any of that, but the general principles of these are transferable to those other things. This is how the operational chlorophyll algorithm operates today from NASA processing. You see, we have more data than we did in the 80s. But again, it is just a ratio of a blue to green reflectance in log space. So in this case, what we're doing, there's a clever idea that came about in the late 90s that I had nothing to do with. That was this maximum band ratio. The general idea is that you take the maximum of your blue or green band as your numerator. And the idea here is this would give you some indication of the kind of quality of water you were getting into. And you've seen in your own data that blue is the peak in some waters, and then all of a sudden you get a green reflectance peak and so forth. And that transition can, help the fidelity of these models. So it's pretty straightforward. You can take a ratio, coincidentally measure, you put them on space, and then you create a 4th order polynomial that goes through. So this, again, I hate that I'm giving you a lecture that has nothing to play with right now, but when you collect your own data, I mean, expectation is you try out one of these algorithms. You're gonna have chlorophyll, you're gonna have radiometry. Like, there's no excuse for not playing with this. It couldn't be simpler. It is 1 line of code. 2 lines if you want to do the ratio outside of the distribution. And
That's pretty much
Here's the
the.
thing, we're only as good as the data we put into it. We apply these globally. It was developed using a modern global. If you look at the map up there, that's what global looks like. So here's problem number one you need to solve. That's not global. It isn't, and it even looks more complete than it really is because that includes probably 20 years worth of data. So all of those, many of those points were one snapshot in time in one season measured. All of these globally. Yes.
The one that meets with FedEx. So he's
rationale for doing.
focused to.
Awesome question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe you have our.
It's actually, you're touching on one of the last slides. I mean, the reality with some of these algorithms is you just look at it saying, I think I can draw a curve through this. There's no, I mean, there are papers that talk about how you can squint your eyes and absorption and backscattering and come up with that this ratio should work. But whether it's a third order, whether it's a sixth order,
Yeah.
honestly, you do it until you find out to minimize your error. That's to do. There used to be something called a modified cubic polynomial where they only did that equation with
Je ne savais pas.
third order. And then
Elle savait qu'elle nous a invités, nous, en pensant à ça.
excellent observation. This is where sometimes, alluding to the last slide, if you don't have some kind of preconceived sense of what the model should be, that's where something like machine learning can help in the sense of.
Merci, attends.
You think about it? Yeah.
Où est-ce qu'il est
All right, so there's another way to do this that's become really, really popular. It's called line height. Really, all it is so a fancy equation up there. The reality is, it is just simply saying. Difference between that baseline and the actual measurements I can come up with this index. And you can see, like, if I move the blue band down, this line is going to become less. So this CI would actually collapse here as well. That there's information there about the pigment concentration. And so what you can do here is, again, you have the measurement you make here of water. Very, very clear water. This relationship actually really holds. In non-clear water, it kind of fails. So again, really, all this is doing is taking some spectral information and exploiting how absorption would work. Really saying that, hey, in this part of the spectrum, the more chlorophyll you have, absorption is going to change. So let's take some information from the radiant signal. All right, so you probably, thinking this through, saying, well, how do I pick these? And this is again where I want to get into, like, what do you do with them? I mean, anybody can make these relationships. And that's not minimizing the work. Like, I built a career on playing with these relationships, but again, they're observation. So how do you know which one is that? And it turns out, if you just look at scatter plots, you really don't know. This is a brilliant paper, but it kind of waved its arms a little bit on what statistic am I looking at to show one method is better than the other. It's that very low chlorophyll region where the agreement works pretty well. And then everything else is don't even want. But if you're eyeballing these matchups, again, you're not talking about a lot of points. Well, depending on what statistic you pick, you could say one might offer you better R squared than the other. What was actually revealed is that these different methods actually change what the satellite imagery looks like. And so this is the exact same picture of the exact same place. There's a lot of unusual features around clouds and things like that, look unnatural. And the other relationship, suddenly they're not there. So just by looking at a different kind of approach, you can see, hey, maybe the answers don't change, but there's benefits in other ways. In this case, I'd rather have a clean imagery. And so what ended up happening then was the opposite. It's brilliant. Just came up with a blending solution. So yeah, I mean, it seems like 2020. Reality is a lot of observational data plugged into models and it uses really, really good. Absolutely not. Is it meaningful? Yes. And really just can't emphasize enough that these exist for bottom depth retrievals, water clarity, KD, POC, over and over and over, and some of them are even nested. Model, like I just showed you, come up with chlorophyll value, and then have another empirical relationship on top of that to get something. So really, all of this is to say is there are some very simple approaches here. It's a little bit of a black box. The data you collect is really, really important. And here's why. And the data is old slide, but I just wanted to drive the point home one more time. But they vary substantially over time. So another problem to try to solve is, again, how do I get better data and more of it? All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. Again, I want you leaving with a good vibe about these algorithms. They're really important. Their advantage, they're fast. Really nothing portable. You don't like the global algorithm, you've got a great data set in your neck of the woods, you can do something really well. And frankly, that's good enough in a lot of places. Like if you work for a regulatory agency and you don't care about a huge long climate signal, you just want to know, hey, today looks okay, tomorrow's a little worse, and the day after is even more worse than that. And I have limited resources out there. You don't have to be thinkers about this. It's when you start thinking about, like, I'm looking for a 10-year climate signal that's like 1% change over 3 decades. So I'm trying to tease out 1/3%, where you have to be a little bit more conscientious about this. A lot of them are immune to atmospheric correction issues, which I'll show you. Sometimes they're insensitive to uncertainties in your reflectances. That's a real good value because, again, if you're taking a ratio and your errors in the same direction, that error kind of cancels itself. They're easily expandable in terms of you want to include other information, or you don't like the log transformation, go to principal component analyses and things. Like there's a lot of little tricks you can play here. Disadvantages of them, they're non-unique, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And this is pervasive everywhere. Clearly geographically biased. This one, meaning that you're just taking a relationship with chlorophyll that can break down in a lot of different places. Like what I put there, that can sometimes be highly sensitive to uncertainties. You really need to know what you're looking at here. Like, they are black boxes, but you shouldn't treat them as such. Now, if something looks weird or you see patterns that don't make sense, maybe there's optically shallow water there that you were unaware of. Again, you have to be conscientious about this, and they're really not predictive. So if you're looking forward for some kind of change that you aren't anticipating, these models are only as good as their input data sets. And if your input data set doesn't have anything that might be predictive of what's happening, then they're not going to work for you. So I don't know how many of you are playing in the remote sensing arena, but do you have any thoughts about these things? Well, I pause for a second. Like, has anybody played with these, or do you have any preconceived notions of your own on what's good and bad about them? You think it's because of the model, or you think it's because of something else? You can expand them to include other parameters like that. And of course, your correction in the water is kind of like fire.
Pour ce qu'on fait, c'est pas grave.
Well,
here's the dirty secret. And the other reason you need to embrace these is whether you like it or not, they're embedded into everything you're going to do from space. They're embedded in atmospheric correction, they're embedded in hydrolite, they're embedded into all your inverse modeling. I mean, this is just what it is. Unless you are physically running those coupled ocean atmosphere systems, where you have a supercomputer, which is not necessarily, that was what was required. So very quickly, turn it over. Atmospheric correction. This is just to point out that you might have 2 different atmospheric correction schemes that give you wildly different reflectances, but their shapes are the same. When you're using these kinds of relationships, sometimes they're immune to shapes. So if you're taking a ratio of this band and this band, generally speaking, and they are differing by approximately the same amount, cancel that out, and so that's a positive. The negative, however, is in that situation, the differences are in the same direction. If they're not in the same direction, you can actually blow up your ratios and your line heights. So in this case, and I know this is a really, really hard thing to read. Band ratio on the bottom, chlorophyll over here. This is one of the polynomials. Just to give you some kind of sense of that. If you have ratios, if you have errors that are roughly in the same direction, say plus or minus 2%, the difference between a perfect entry and kind of an off one, isn't really that big, and that's the green lines here. But these other colors are like, let's say your blue band is 10% off in a direction that's different than your green band. You can see that sometimes my ratio is supposed to be here, but my blue is 10% biased high. My ratio is suddenly you can be off by 50%. So you have to be careful with some of these. What do you mean by Kurt put in here, and if you read the text really quickly, have a band ratio that's identical.
Ah non, mais c'est une. Je cherche une plaque pour mettre la.
So that's a unique. Looking at it the other way, these are some simulations Colin and I did using hydrolytes. Every single spectrum here uses roughly the same chlorophyll value. So yeah, this is what we mean by non-unique fat. All of these are different scenarios where chlorophyll is roughly 1. And we did this simply by moving the chlorophyll maximum up and down in the water column, just like you did today.
Okay.
Geographically biased, full paper that's about 10 years ago. Slug of data is the data set, but you can see that data set varies by ocean. And so, hey, this is a great global relationship compared to some bias in the Southern Ocean. Example. Talked about case, not case, two case, not these are 2 case 1. Same thing, this time the analysis was done by looking at how much CDOM was in the water with them. So you can't see this, but this is basically the ratio of a CDOM at 443 to chlorophyll. And you can see that there is a bias slug as well too. Good news is you have some tricks that you can put uncertainties on all of this. Like if you become a NASA proposer, trust me, if you don't put an analytical method to calculate uncertainties into your proposal, the panel will not look favorably on you. Fortunately, there's some work out there that actually can do the analytical solution for you. But again, I don't know whether, I think we are this week talking more about uncertainty as well. The math is there, the measurements aren't there. So it's really easy to say, I have an analytical solution. I can do partial derivatives and I can come up with, I have a remote sensing reflectance error, go through the math, but it doesn't encapsulate the measurement error. It doesn't encapsulate the error associated with the fit coefficients if, for example, you chose the wrong model. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into there as well. And then in getting, this is basically my last slide to hand over to Patrick. If you have no idea what the mathematical form of the model is, you're stuck there too. And that's where some of these more emerging techniques. Right, so any questions for me for that? Oh, it's completely, I don't know what you did last week. I don't know if this is different or not. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also.
Ah, Maurice,
Yeah,
j'ai besoin de ça. J'ai dit savoir.
like, if you're taking coastal
Alors,
measures,
au pire des cas, on va à un instant, regarde plus souvent.
they're widely different, but it's important that there's like, open ocean measurements in your data set. That's something that I think, I struggle with maybe developing, so. So I've been working on.
Yeah.
Francis, tu vas aller, mais.
Yeah, in the ocean.
Bonjour.
Not going to be important to do. It's coastal measurements, which are way easier to do, but it's also important to do.
Encore.
Honestly, it's one of the, if I gave you this data set, polynomial, each one of you would come up with a different
Yeah.
fit. And all of them would look like this. You wouldn't have a bend here, you wouldn't have a bend here because nobody collects open ocean data.
Oui, et donc il suffit d'en avoir une qui descend.
Look at like a density plot of this.
Tu regardes juste si tu mets ton envers, tu transfères.
That's because it's really easy to go out and collect.
Il y a un globe. Donc, tu auras une selfie aussi.
Making it bad.
C'est ce qu'on avait acheté pour Internet.
Ouais, je me souviens.
This is there too. And then frankly, back to your problem. Hey, I'm only in my little neck of the woods, you're gonna get a slice of data that's a shotgun blast, and how do you draw a line through that? You know, you have an infinite number of lines. So it's really hard to do that stuff as well. Yeah, but again, the ocean's actually pretty forgiving on global scales, like this relationship is incredibly robust. It doesn't work place to place, but it does work very, very well globally. And it is incredibly good at being stable, meaning if you are looking for qualitative trends and things, this is usually pretty good on global scales. Now, if you're saying that you really need to know the difference between 1.0 and 1.05, or your color centric. All right, I'm here. More math in the next one, but it'll still be fun.
This one,
This is a mixture of things. And that's kind of where this becomes a little bit more problematic. And there are papers that actually talk about how to adjust these for a CDOM load. You know, Andre Morel has a nice one from I think 2009 that says there's a CDOM index. But yes, these are.
Anything anymore.
I mean, I'm not a super. But the idea behind these is a case one idea. Everything is manageable, varies with nothing else. You know, that's true. And that's why everything is really, really squirrely up here. All right, man, I think you are I think I'm done. Yeah, I'm done. Okay. Perfectly on time.
Ben là, il dit
What's that, Charlotte? Emmanuel?
but flight from Rochester to New York at this time. Donc, il veut même pas prendre un billet pour Boston.
Charlotte, are you guys talking to us?
Okay.
Okay, so that yeah,
Ouais,
I can actually no, Charlotte's in charge. I can't leave them from here.
Il y a le train qui m'intéresse aussi. Chut. Le train, mais le train, il y en a quand même pas mal.
Yeah, but Charlotte's in charge.
C'est ça exactement. Mais le dernier, c'est the scenic tree route, they call it. Mais du coup, I don't, whatever. We'll see when he gets to New York.
Hey, Charlotte, can you hear me? Give me one sec. I was trying to change the color profile because it's it clearly is a little messed up. Now I changed it so much. Oh, there we go. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, this follows quite closely to Jeremy's talk, but I am going to give you a bit more of an overview just about machine learning. I'm going to try pretty hard to stick to 30 minutes. Feel free to stop any time. So, how many of you guys have ever tried to mess around with any kind of machine learning algorithm via any coding language or anything? Okay, a couple hands. So the very broad definition I'm going to give you is just that machine learning algorithms do a task without you telling them exactly how to do that task based on patterns inherent in the data. And why would we want to use machine learning when some of these band ratio algorithms work really well? Well, in remote sensing in general, we have sometimes super high spatial resolution. This is some drone imagery I collected that's 0.05 meter. And actually the one on the right is sub-centimeter imagery. Now, we don't really have that in ocean color, but we actually have a similar scale where we're increasing our resolution. We have really complex spectral dimensions. This is SPG, which is sort of the new version, the equivalent of PACE for terrestrial ecosystems. And then sometimes we have really dense time series. We can maybe want to look at data every day for multiple years. We also often have a really complex atmospheric dynamic. If we have dust, and let's say we want to actually get ocean color from somewhere in the dust, it might be extremely hard to come up with an analytical approach to retrieve that data. So at its most basic, almost all the machine learning we'll be talking about, they classify data, they regress data, they cluster it. There's really just those simple things, and they'll do it for you. So many talks start with this. And if you see that, I want you immediately to be suspicious. It's amazing. They're probably trying to sell you something, or they're trying to convince you to use their product. I want you to think of this, where we want to know if it's an orange or an apple, and we have 2 dimensions of data. We have size and color, and we're going to get the algorithm to draw that line through the data. That is machine learning. This is not machine learning. Maybe we want to have the computer automatically draw a relationship through data like this. We want to generate a regression. Maybe we have a data set that we want to separate. We want to be able to classify these 2 different things, but we can't easily draw a straight line through it. So we're going to have the computer do that. So this could mean all these things, predicting what Netflix show you're going to watch, estimating chlorophyll, selling you ads, predicting community composition of phytoplankton. These are the same things. They're just often highly dimensional. I kind of like this plot. I was debating whether or not to use this one. Don't worry at all about reinforcement learning. That's like teaching a car how to drive. We are talking about classifying data, regressing data, and clustering data. That is what machine learning that we are interested in does. I love this comic from XKCD. I want you to have this in your mind every time you think about an algorithm you're using. And really, you should read through all these. Go back to the slide. And often, we're just fitting a line, but you're not sure how to fit that line. And a lot of neural networks are doing this, where they work really well for data within the range you trained it on. The second you go out of the range you trained it on, you have no idea what the shape of that curve looks like. You never constrained it. Anyways, I like this a lot. I'm not going to go through all kinds of models. I'm going to talk about 1 or 2. This is the simplest machine learning model you can imagine. It's called K nearest neighbors. All it does, let's say you give it 2 dimensions. Let's say you give it phycoerythrin, which is a pigment, and chlorophyll A, and you know a bunch of your data. Let's say you use an ICD or you use the microscope, and you know Synechococcus. These data points are Synechococcus, and this is Chlorococcus. You get a new data point. All K nearest neighbors does is say, what is this closest to? What is the nearest neighbor for this new data point? And I'm going to call it that. And this is machine learning. This is quite effective. Sometimes it'll be super effective, and it's very nice because you know exactly how it's working. I'm going to talk more about deep learning in the second half, but this is fitting a neural network to the red data. So the blue is the predicted out of a neural network. The red is some data that we have, the training data, and we're slowly fitting it. The model's learning, and it's getting better and better and better. Now, this is actually not ocean color data, but you can imagine, let's say I wouldn't do this, but let's say you want to predict chlorophyll on the Y based on day of the year on the X. This might actually be, a cycle where, like in the subtropical gyre, where you have a bit of a spring bloom, a minima in the summer, and then you have a fall bloom again. You can imagine you could do this. You could train a model to do this. You might not want to. You guys already heard this quote about how all models are wrong, some are useful. Oftentimes, especially in deep learning, using neural networks, models can be wildly wrong in unpredictable ways. And to be usable, to allow yourself to use them, you have to aggressively test. You have to come up with creative ways to evaluate. You really have to convince yourself it's robust, because what you don't want is this. You don't want a regression that's crazy. A neural network can memorize 10 million data points. It can memorize anything you give it if you make it big enough, but it's going to create some function that's insane and doesn't actually have very good predictive or robust capability. What we often want, like what we're looking for, the holy grail in machine learning, is generalizability across time, across space, across ecosystems. This model is not very generalized. It's hitting every single data point. But what we want is a curve like this. We get most of them on one side, most on the other. You guys understand the classification regression difference here? We might classify phytoplankton types based on, remote sensing reflectance, or we might want to regress CDOM based on RRS, something like that. I'm just going to mention these two. We're not going to talk about this, but I think one of the most effective uses of machine learning is just to cluster your data when you don't understand your patterns or other things. And this is just an abstract example, but you can imagine you have a ton of RRS, you just cluster it. You want to find natural groupings. Maybe you're interested in different water types. One of my projects for the class project when I took this was just clustering our ACS data, and you can see these clusters change as we move offshore. It's often a really nice initial data exploration technique. And then I'll talk more about this at the end, but I often think of machine learning as interpolating, as basically you're creating some function that allows you to interpolate between data you know the value for and data you want to know the value for. And there's some really powerful work coming out using deep learning to interpolate, to fill gaps, fill cloudy spots. For example, this was the initial data in this model. This paper just came out a couple weeks ago. This is where they simulated clouds, and they were able to repredict this with a model that only saw that. It's making a lot of assumptions about spatial structure. It's making a lot of assumptions about what sea surface temperature looks like. Anyway, there's a bunch of ways to do this. And the last category I just want to mention is outlier detection. Here we have 5 different models for detecting outliers. You can imagine, let's say your RRS, if you just look at if blue and green were on the X and Y axis. What is an outlier? There are lots of different models to look at that. They work in very different ways. But it can be a really effective way to know if some of your data is bogus. Okay. Those are just approaches things you can do with machine learning. I'm gonna go through a bit of a rundown of deep learning, and then we'll talk about some specific applications. So machine learning is used very broadly. It's very similar to this whole field of statistical inference. In many ways, they're actually the same tools. They're just used with a different community. They're used for a different purpose. Statistical inference is often used to understand something like your distribution or understand, the inputs. Machine learning is used to make predictions, make estimations. There is this neighbor field of computer vision, which is very tightly coupled. Okay, so in classical programming, let's say you want to decide if something is sand or plants, you might generate some rules. You might say, above this brightness threshold, above this band ratio, it's a plant, and below it's sand. And machine learning, you're giving it data, you're telling it the answer, and you're asking it to generate the rules. NDVI, we talked about, it's just a normalized ratio of red to near infrared. Plants reflected on near infrared, they absorb red, terrestrial plants. And so you can imagine if we wanted to learn this green line here. So we might say a rule is that it's greater than 0.5. Instead, in machine learning, we're just going to give it NDVI and a bunch of pixels that you know the answer for. Ask it to generate the rules. Does that make sense? And this is all this kind of stuff that you've probably heard of. Decision trees, random forests, naive Bayes, max likelihood, k-nearest neighbor. These are lots of very effective algorithms that do this very well. Now, sometimes you might want to decide the rule. There are lots of cases where if you understand a system really well, you might want to generate the rule. There's some where maybe you can't for some reason or another. Yeah.
Sorry, what is an NDVI? I get.
It's just a ratio of red to near infrared. It doesn't really matter in this system, except that the whole point is plants, when they're alive, reflect a lot of near infrared, and they absorb in the red. So if you take that ratio, plants will be high in the NDVI. So the next step, which really I think the better analogy here is with imagery, in the typical, what I'll call shallow machine learning, we at least gave it what NDVI was. So we give it a feature that it can more quickly learn some rules about. In deep learning, we don't tell it this ratio. We just give it the raw data. It extracts the features. Some people call neural networks feature extractors. And then it decides its classification. So basically, we're just giving it the raw data. It's learning all the relationships it needs to even generate the rules that are going to do this classification. And often where this is really the only pathway, the only effective way to do this is with imagery data or with really complex spatiotemporal series. You know, let's say here we want it to classify all these different land cover types in this drone imagery. Well, we might have to decide all these features for trees and oysters and texture, texture complexity might help distinguish oysters. And deep learning, it's going to learn all that on its own. Yeah. And really the thing is here, once we get, the reason why this is so effective in natural imagery, like with phone imagery and everything all these computer vision approaches online that identify your face, it's extremely hard to come up with a rule set to say, this is, Matt versus Patrick. Because it's super fine details and it just, in all lighting conditions, I mean, can you imagine the rules you'd have to define? Basically, that field was stagnant like until 10 years ago because people couldn't do this. Then they started using neural networks to learn millions and millions of relationships between the input image and somebody's name. And this works. I have a bunch of work doing this in coastal wetlands and coastal areas, and it works extremely well. The second half of this slide series, which I'm not going to go through, I'm going to put online, and it really goes through this in depth. And I have a bunch of resources if you want to learn more about this. We don't even have close to time for it, but I just want to say the simplest neural network. Imagine we want to predict chlorophyll based on blue and green. These two neurons is what they're called, are the inputs. This one neuron is the output, and there's this hidden layer in the middle. When a neural network is learning, all it's doing is generating relationships between these to optimize some output. So basically, the neural network will be full of weights, which, like, let's say this is 0.1, and this is 0.2, and this is 0.7. And it's generating relationships between those inputs to transform it into some output. We could do this with any inputs we want. We could predict chlorophyll based on anything. And the only thing I really want you to take away is basically that just leads to a big function. That's just a big function with a bunch of coefficients, the whole neural network. And we can recreate almost any nonlinear transformation. We could train a neural network with the same data Jeremy put into that band ratio, and it would probably generate a function that's actually quite similar to that band ratio if we train it the right way and force it to do that. So you imagine there are all these, and it's generating, let's say here, both of them are going here. This is a relationship between blue and green. There also will be another layer here that will be relationships between these relationships, and so on. I realize this is a little abstract. You'll need to hear this a few times, I think, for it to make intuitive sense. But this is all that it's doing. And then at the end, there's what's called a loss function or a cost function. And so the neural network basically is punished every time it doesn't predict chlorophyll right. And it just tries to minimize that loss function. What that actually looks like, again, this is just a giant function with a bunch of coefficients. You take the derivative of it, you get the slope of this manifold here, and it's trying to jump down that manifold. So actually, it's really nice. There's some beautiful papers on this. There's one just called Deep Learning in Nature by Jan LeCun that describes this super well. What do you get when you take the derivative of a function? the slope. So you have no idea what this hyperdimensional manifold looks like, but you know your slope wherever you are. And all you do, let's say you're here, you just go in the opposite direction of the slope. You just jump down. So you just move, let's say you have a million coefficients in this function. All you do is just alter them, so you jump down a little bit, jump down a little bit, down a little bit. And eventually you want to get to the spot where the difference between your predicted chlorophyll and the chlorophyll of the label data is minimized. This, like, it's called backpropagation gradient descent. You descend down this gradient, allow this whole field to explode. Like once we got computers that were good enough to do this, it allowed everything, like all the image analysis that your phone does, and a ton of deep learning, and like the whole chat GPT apparatus just does exactly this. All deep learning does this. Again, I realize this is abstract, but does that make sense? An important point here is that there's not like one minima spot. There are often tons of local minima, and you never even find the global minima. If you train a neural network randomly, you're going to get to a different function. Typically, they're very similar. And maybe you're just learning this line to divide your training data and try and make predictions in the future. But again, neural networks can memorize millions of data points. Those huge functions can do any transformation you want. And often you could easily overfit to do something like this. You don't want that either. You probably want that. Yep. Yeah, I'm not really going to go into that, but typically with neural networks, because they can memorize everything, you have your training data, you have what's called validation data, where you assess the loss function again and again and again, because you're doing this hundreds of times, where you're jumping down that manifold. And then once that you're done, you think it's good enough, you'll have an external evaluation or test data set that's maybe in a different geographic region or different year, where you'll test it, because it can overfit to the validation data also. Okay, I just love this. I'm going to show this really quick. So I highly recommend you play around with this for 5 minutes. Not right now, but as soon as we're done. This is this amazing visualization from Google where you actually are training a neural network. These are all the neurons, and this is the output. So all we're giving it, we're trying to teach it to classify, to regress. Basically, orange is -1, green is 1. And all we're giving it, the input features, are just the X and Y coordinates. So we're giving it the coordinates on this map, and we're telling it to learn. And you can see here, basically really quickly, this one learns this division. We can change what that looks like. So now, again, it's much more complex surface, the X and Y, and we actually have all these different spots. This is the model trying to learn to predict. And these are so it's, this is the X and Y coordinates, and it's learning these relationships between them, and then combining those relationships here, the width of these lines indicates the strength of those relationships. And the way the model actually is structured is not intuitive. There's no real meaning for us often about these weights and relationships. We can abstract it a little bit, but it's extremely hard. And basically, like, even with the simplest problem, the relationships it learns are not ones we would probably use ourselves to make some prediction. So this is, when people say it's a black box, it's not a black box. You can see exactly what it's doing, but in the box doesn't make sense. Sorry, say it again. So if you add more, it basically gets more capacity to learn more complex transformations from input to output. That's what you're asking? Absolutely. The more hidden layers you're adding, the more likely it is to overfit, because the more capacity it has to memorize exactly what you give it. And so let's give it a more so now it's going to try and learn a decision boundary between these. This is a classification problem, not regression. Pretty good. let's give it a more complex. So now we want to actually try and learn this. So this, what boundary would you define here just based on X and Y coordinates? To do this, it's really hard. And I want you guys to think about this. If you're ever using a neural network, somebody else's or one you made, it's learning a crazy transformation function like this that has no physical basis in like some actual physical understanding you might have of the system. Sometimes they work really well, and if you test them right, they can be amazing. But they're doing something like this. These are relationship, so you can see here, it's learning a really strong relationship between these two, and it's not doing very well. But actually, you could have something like this where it tests, if all your test data was here and here, again, let's just say you certain type of water, it might actually score really well when you evaluate it. Yeah.
I know how many layers to.
How do you know how many hidden layers to include? Often you want the smallest, simplest model you can that is able to fit the data. So you often want to see if it can overfit your training data. If it can't, it doesn't even have the capacity to learn the relationships. You want to try to overfit with the smallest model you can, and then you want to make sure it's really well evaluated. Yep.
Is there any way to add a physics constraint to that?
Yeah, there's a whole small growing field of physically constrained neural networks where you can't, you can't go beyond some parameters. Yeah, it's fledgling, but it's seemingly working well. There's also often like people are simulating, climate models with neural networks because they're much faster to run. And then every like 10th step, they'll check it with a physical model to see if it's gone beyond some boundary. I'm not going to go in that here, but I can send you, there are actually a couple of papers linked at the end that do that. I think it's pretty exciting. Okay, so deep learning is building those sorts of neural networks. We only have 5 or 6 minutes left. I'm going to breeze through these. I really just want you to remember convolutional neural networks. It's a fancy name. It just means we're doing this similar process for imagery data, where you're running filters over an image. You're building relationships between parts of the image. Typically, the way a CNN will work is you're like learning about edges and color gradients and textures, and then you're combining those different types of edge structures and color gradients and textures into different relationships. So you can imagine here, there's a classic example of like classifying hand-drawn digits. And this was successfully solved in 2014. Like this is a solved problem. It's crazy. When I was doing my undergrad in computer science, this was unsolved. No one could do it like even above 90% accuracy. And now the models are full human, well, like 99.99%, as good as anybody here could do it. And it's just learning relationships. You can imagine how you would devise some rules to classify a 4, like maybe 2 lines that are parallel followed by a line under them, but they're different types of 4s. And then these last layers in the model are what I usually call like semantically meaningful pixels, where like if this pixel is lit up, it's because in the layers before it had all those right indicators for a 4. And then you end up just outputting it as a 4. Yeah, we don't really have time for this, but it's doing this exact same step down this gradient. And I just want you to think CNNs are able to analyze imagery, any type of matrix. It could be bands, it could be like time on the Z dimension, but matrices, building these increasingly hierarchical and abstract relationships between what's in the pixels. And again, CNNs are what do every type of vision problem. So predicting your face, predicting, in like whether it's a hummingbird or a squirrel and all types of imagery. Super effective and basically human level. Yeah. Sorry, Nick had a question behind you.
No, the pretty blue one brown.
I've got it linked at the end of this. That is the best intuitive explanation. Watch the first one, it's 20 minutes. Watch it. I've probably watched it 5 times. Like I used to be my roommate in San Francisco. And he now just makes a living making these absolutely beautiful geometric explanations of everything. If you forget what the cross product is, like watch his video. Yeah,
What was that final step to get from 90? Making,
sorry, to get from which, at the end?
yeah, what's the final step to get your accuracy to 90%?
Using CNN.
Using, what were they using? before?
Well, for a while they were using just this. It's called a multi-layer perceptron, just a simple neural network. And then before that, like from the 60s to the 90s, they were trying to devise rules. They thought like expert guided AI was the solution. And so you have 1,000 rules to decide how to do it.
Okay.
But now you just give it 10,000 examples and it learns.
Okay.
I mean, you can code this up. We could do it in 30 minutes.
Okay.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, there are other types of neural networks that are specialized for different types of data. There's what's called a recurrent neural network for temporal data, sequence data. ChatGPT is basically a different type. It's called a transformer. It's built for sequence data. All it does exactly this, and the whole apparatus of ChatGPT is just trained to predict the next word based on like the whole internet. But it does this exact same structure. Okay. We use machine learning because it allows us to represent complex nonlinear relationships across all the dimensions we care about. You can imagine that's building relationships between bands. It could be maybe there's a spatial context you really care about, like in a seascape or chlorophyll patterns or sea surface temperature patterns that are really hard to come up with an encoding your own. You can encode it with this. You can learn temporal relationships. You can combine sensing modalities. You can imagine you can put everything you want into those first neurons and predict whatever you want. This is a nice overview paper of just deep learning and remote sensing I recommend. I'll go through it. Okay. I'm gonna speed this up, Jeremy. I don't want to cut into your time. I'm gonna go through a few case studies and then just talk about pitfalls and sort of a vision. This is a paper we did. I think Colin was talking about this idea where we classify SCD data with CNNs. This is basically what people are using to do exactly what you guys did. But it's really hard if we compare like what was a fairly state-of-the-art CNN to just an expert taxonomist. We have major differences in what the CNN output and what we manually validated, even though we were scoring like 99% on all of our test data. But we exposed it to new data it had never seen, and types of phytoplankton it had never seen, morphologies of species it did know that it had never seen. We compared this in a different paper to a bunch of HPLC measurements. And here, I mean, you can see on these curves, this is 2 different years, basically two seasonal cycles on the Western United Peninsula. And you can see the HPLC, while the patterns are the same, like total biomass is quite similar, they're pretty different chunks of those curves. So buyer beware. And a big part of the reason this is super hard in the types of problems you were working on is not just the tiny cells, but there's this really long tail of phytoplankton species. No matter where you are in the ocean, there's going to be tons of rare species. And that means even if, let's say you have 50,000 images that you labeled, you went through and you were super confident in. Well, if there are all these species that show up rarely, but common enough to throw off your model, you're almost never going to capture them. And this is an ongoing problem, an unsolved problem. You can have what's called semi-supervised learning, where the CNN outputs predictions and you actually check all of them, but it's already done, so you can just really quickly go through. Or that these models do output like a confidence score, which is not the probability of being accurate, but you can filter all the low confidence models. And there are a lot of conservation groups that are doing this, like look, emit cameras set up, where rare birds are, and they want to get every super endangered bird. And so they'll, even if the model is even a tiny bit unconfident at what it is, they'll go through and filter because they want to track every bird. I'm just going to flip through these, but quickly, you can do things like we can classify sea turtles in drone imagery. We just had a paper come out this week classifying whales from satellite imagery. I was able to detect only gray whales and humpbacks. They're the only ones that are like bright enough to be visible. And this is sub-meter imagery. So this is worldview 3. But it works quite well when it's calm. A lot of caveats. We can actually do what's called semantic segmentation, that is like outlining the exact outline of all kinds of different stuff in imagery. I did this on an oyster reef. This came out 2 years ago. Okay, so again, it is amazing that we can represent these complex relationships, but I really want to emphasize simplicity is beautiful if it's feasible. You would never use this if you can represent it with a band ratio. Never do this if you can do something like, you wouldn't want to train, you could train a neural network to estimate KD, or you could calculate KD, because you guys know how to do that now. This is the second to last slide, I think. It's just a big thing of text for you guys to refer to. You cannot extrapolate with any of these techniques. Machine learning is not meant for extrapolation. I think a good heuristic for you to have is that machine learning interpolates. Again, you saw that one curve that went wild as soon as you were outside of your boundary, and that happens all the time. I trained this neural network to classify oyster reefs, and it was working super well in all conditions, but I trained it in the summer, and then I ran it in the fall, starting in the spring, when we have like blooms of Spartina around, and it didn't know what anything was, because for some reason it was using like the mud spatial context around the oyster reef to make the prediction. And as soon as it saw a little green around it, it went haywire. And it's really hard to test for all those different possibilities. So you really have to do it creatively. You can imagine, you know, that means for us, if you want to predict chlorophyll, you need to test, you need to train it on open ocean data in the Atlantic, test it in the Pacific, test it in a different season. The simpler, the better. And if you create some monster, amazing, beautiful neural network, and it's just as good as the ocean color index that Jeremy was showing, what do you think's better? You know, what's more useful for the community? What's more predictable? And it's going to take a long time to run that giant neural network. There is a lot of work coming out that's doing this. It's like a 1% improvement using some really fancy machine learning, and it's not clear who it's serving. And again, because we can't extrapolate, and because of this long tail of a lot of things we care about, anomalies often are the most important thing. And a lot of machine learning fully shields us from anomalies. Now, there is cool machine learning techniques to do anomaly detection, and so they can often be paired. It can be paired to do hand in hand. But you need to be careful about this. And I often think about this as, you know, different ways of encoding. So again, you can encode light attenuation into a KD value based on physical insight and how you know the physics works. But if you want to encode a spatial pattern of chlorophyll, it's not clear how you can do that without machine learning, without this sort of approach. And I think despite how powerful some of these things are at modeling complex relationships, if you don't have physical insight into the system, they're going to be problematic. So you can create relationships between any variables you want and make predictions, but if there's no real pattern and you're basing it off some correlation that is maybe only applicable in Harpswell Sound, it's just something to be worried about. Because again, we're fitting these types of curves. This is what machine learning is doing. I'm just going to leave this up. This is for you guys to go through. A couple textbooks that I love that are highly readable. This is what Nick mentioned. You got to watch this. It's so fun. And I rewatched his whole calculus series. He has he redoes like all these fundamental calculus points from a geometric point of view, which is beautiful. He wrote his entire own animation library just to make these videos. It's brilliant. Okay. And this is really what I want you to remember. Not that, this. Thanks. Questions? Any?
You were mentioning that the confidence is not the same as the difference with anomalous determining the output. And what is it?
So not accurate, but the confidence of the model is not the same as a real probability. And there are even models that will say they output probability, like a mixture density network, but it's not the actual probability. It's a probability based on what the model knows about the distribution, which is not the real distribution. And so again, if it had a rare class, let's say a rare type of flagella that it had never seen, it might give you a high confidence that it was correct on it, but it doesn't have, there's no way it can predict the real probability that is that species, because it's never seen it. And it's actually based on uncertainty in the neural network, backpropagation process, which is not, it is a decent filter, but it's not probability. You should interpret it as that. I would just call it a confidence in quotations.
Is there a way? How would you recommend like writing in a question that you would answer? Is it- Yeah, like if I'm trying to understand, let's say, spatial patterns of things in a color dimension,
Mhm.
like is there a way that has to get, that question has to get framed for machine learning? Like I was, maybe that's. Like,
Go ahead.
do you need to give it a like question?
Not, I mean, I think that that is the beauty also, especially with lots of clustering techniques, or just seeing if correlations exist. It can be fully exploratory. It doesn't need to be question based, but
It just gives you like relationships.
right. And sometimes, like I had a problem recently where I was trying to see if I could predict the chlorophyll vertical structure from a bunch of physical measurements of turbulence and other things. I didn't actually want to make a prediction. I wanted to make an inference about how to do that, but I had no idea what statistical model to use. So I used a random forest model to see if I was able to do this prediction well. Turned out it was uncorrelated to everything I had. It was related to like greater Gulf Stream meander structure, which it helped me illuminate that how bad it was. Yeah, I think it's super broad. I mean, any kind of question or exploration you want. So it's 11:10. I have a quick coding exercise, but I think we could do it after lunch, Jeremy. You have 45 minutes? Pretty close. I don't want to cut into that. Yeah, your lecture is after lunch, right? Let's do this after. So we can do it after your lecture. I plan on taking about 15 minutes. I'll share this with y'all. It's already up on the website, but basically I go through and recreate, show it to you in about 2 minutes, and then we'll walk through it. I really like doing demos in this Colab, which is basically a Jupyter notebook hosted by Google with all the libraries we want already installed. I go through and create exactly the ocean color index that Jeremy mentioned from Huddle. So this is that final figure from his paper, where I basically filtered exactly like he said in the paper, go through and create the exact same relationship. There's like the error is only on like the 20th decimal point. It was really nice that his paper was descriptive enough to be able to get this. Actually, I emailed Jeremy like 2 years ago for I think 1 or 2 other questions about it. But really, this is what should have accompanied his paper. I mean, that was 10, 12 years ago, but now this is what should accompany anything you do. But then I just go and show doing this with a couple different machine learning algorithms, and I'll have you guys just run through this. You don't need to change any of the code, you just run it, and it'll output all the figures. So we'll do this briefly after lunch and discuss. And I think from there, Jeremy, I'll swap it back over. But any final questions? Hey, Manuel, I'm going to jump off just to end the video and I'll start it right back up.